May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be ever acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Once again, good morning, St. Michael's. This is my second greeting to you if you were here last week. If you weren't, very warm greetings and welcome. I am your almost brand new interim rector, and it's such an honor and a privilege to be here with you. I'm going to begin, as I did last week, with a little bit more of a personal introduction. It might strike you as just slightly boastful, but it will become quickly apparent that it's anything but in the broader context of the sermon. So, beginning around graduation from high school, I began to assemble a relatively extensive pedigree. I did my undergraduate education and received bachelor's degrees in physics and math from MIT, followed immediately by a master's degree from UC Berkeley in science and math education. I then spent several years in the teaching field, working at a variety of high schools and even briefly as adjunct faculty at a university. And then answered the call to ministry, got a Master of Divinity, and then moved on to multiple positions in the Episcopal Church, most recently, of course, this one. Now, all of this, I think, was unconsciously driven by something that I'm guessing many of you can resonate with. I think it came partly from family and partly from the culture that surrounds us in this part of the world, at least. And it's the sense that all of this sort of stuff is what gives life its value. We have to read more. We have to study more and learn more. We have to work more, do more, achieve more, be more. And I think I was so steeped in a culture, in a context that taught that in every possible spoken and unspoken way, that I just sort of went with it. Didn't even examine what was driving the thinking and the behavior. Now let me see a show of hands. How many of you here in this sanctuary can maybe to some extent resonate with that way of thinking and living? I'm not surprised to see almost unanimity. Now, here's where it's going to dovetail very nicely with the gospel message we received from today's scriptures. What I just described, even though you can't assign an exact dollar amount to it, is actually a form of wealth. It's a form of earthly wealth. Our achievements, our pedigrees, they are definitely a richness of sorts. Now, today's scriptures, I'm imagining you caught, had a very discernible theme to them. All of them were about going all in with and for God. We have this widow at Zarephath who has nothing left for herself and her son but a tiny bit of meal and a tiny bit of oil. And yet the prophet Elijah shows up and says, "Bake me something with that." And of course her reaction is, well, then we starve one day sooner. But she does. And lo and behold, the result is quite different. Hebrews, slightly different tack, but Christ has entered into a sanctuary. Not a copy of the true one made with human hands, but into heaven itself. Nothing short of the ultimate, of the real deal. of the direct and immediate presence of God the Father. And then in the gospel, we have Jesus sitting opposite the treasury in the temple. And all of these wealthy people with all kinds of means and resources, come in and give, to their credit, quite generously. I think sometimes we think Jesus is denigrating that in this text. I promise you, he's not. He would still honor that. But then this poor widow shows up, and she has nothing but 2 copper pennies to her name. She puts that all in, and he says, look, she just gave more than all of them. The message is pretty clear. Going all in for God, which is, after all, the very crux of our faith, is it not? Requires giving all we have out of our poverty. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that especially in Kings and in Luke, there is some speaking of material poverty going on. And for those of you who are Bible nerds, you'll know that the Beatitudes appear in 2 different Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Luke begins with one that is unquestionably about material poverty. Blessed are the poor. Done. Matthew, however, notes that there are multiple ways to have poverty. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Now, this is probably really good news, because for whatever reason, it is largely out of our control how much wealth and how much poverty we have in life, especially if we expand our definition to include things other than just money and material goods. But today's scriptures tell us for certain that to go all in for God means finding those areas in our life where we are poor, and from that poverty giving everything. I think it relates to how I began this sermon. I'm going to go really Bible and theological nerd on you, but I promise I'll bring you back from that edge. There are, throughout the 2,000 years that the Christian tradition has existed, 2 main strands of spirituality. In Latin, they've been referred to as the via positiva and the via negativa. In Greek, cataphatic spirituality and apophatic spirituality. Now, if that set your head swimming, let me make it much simpler. The cataphatic, or the via positiva, is that culture I talked about at the beginning. Memorize the Bible, study more, pray more, do more for the church, receive the sacraments more often, be more, do more, more, and that will get you closer to God. Here in the West, we often talk and act as if that is the only valid spirituality that there is. But the apophatic spirituality, which is much more common in the Eastern Orthodox Church, here in the West, you're more likely to see it in a place like Zen Buddhism, is based on the notion that more, using your mind, your body, your voice more, has its limits. It will never get you all the way to God, because God is infinite and we are finite. We are knowable, God is unknowable. And for that reason, if we really want to go all in, to make a full approach, instead of filling ourselves, we must empty ourselves. It requires intentionally cultivating a state of spiritual poverty. Intentionally doing the opposite of everything I began with in the first minute or 2 of this sermon. Perhaps having an opportunity to add more letters behind our name, perhaps having an opportunity to lead something, to gain another credential, another feather in our caps, another achievement that someone will list in our obituaries. And to say, maybe this time I'm going to pass that one up. Maybe at this moment it is more important to be still and to know that God is God. We are surrounded by a culture that screams at us, no, don't do that. That makes you weak and ineffective and lazy, and you're going to get left behind. But today's scriptures say no. That's the recipe for building up the temple of God. That's the recipe for a tiny little jar of meal and a tiny little jar of oil that for months and years on end will never fail. So my thought is, can we bring a little bit more of that via negativa, a little bit more of that apophatic spirituality into our lives? Can we dare to be spiritually poor? To be and do and think and speak a little bit less? I just invite a tiny little experiment. See what it does. See if you don't find yourself suddenly in the place of that widow, both widows, who found that giving out of their poverty, whether material or spiritual, actually made them rich beyond their wildest dreams. And to conclude, I would be remiss to not note where we stand in history today. Between last week and this week, we learned the results of one of the most hotly contested elections, every level from federal down to local, in many of our memories. And of course, just looking around this sanctuary, let alone our city, our state, our nation, there's going to be a huge variety of reactions to that. Everything from exultation to despair and everything in between. I'm going to suggest bringing an apophatic spirituality to that as well. When we allow our emotions, our thoughts, our words to focus so intensely, and it doesn't matter whether it's joy or despair, they're just opposite sides of the same coin, on who or what happens to be in power in the secular sense, I think we are being far too spiritually rich and in a false sort of way. We aren't going all in with God. This is a place where I believe God is right now calling us to empty ourselves, to realize that even though we treasure our elected democracy, and it matters to us very much what happens to it, that we are ultimately not citizens of a representative democracy, but free and dignified subjects of a kingdom with an eternal king who never changes. 2 weeks from now, as we conclude ordinary time and move into Advent, we will be celebrating Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Those aren't just idle words. That is where our true citizenship lies. So again, I know it's hard. I know we're steeped in a culture that says, do more, think more, be attached to more. But can we empty ourselves